All right, guys, we are now live on the site. I want to welcome everybody to our Wednesday nights each week, gosh, since early or sometime in January for conversations with Cougars. And I'm so pleased to have longtime sports writer Jon Johnson as my guest tonight. Jon, it's good to see you, and I really appreciate you having some time for us tonight.
Thank you, Bernard, and I'm honored to be on here. I know this is a cool thing that you're doing each week, and it brings back a lot of memories, I guess, for a lot of people. It does. It will me as well.
It really has, and I never know who's going to pop in during the live part of the conversation, and that's what makes it fun. Everybody's collective memories, whether they're accurate or not, usually rise to the occasion, and it's really fun just to have some interaction. And for those of you who don't know Jon, then you haven't been in the Wiregrass very long, or you have not followed sports. Jon's been an active writer and member of the Wiregrass sports community since the mid 80s. He's in the Wiregrass Hall of Fame, Sports Hall of Fame. His titles and his accomplishments, we could be here for 30 minutes. That's just how important Jon is to the fabric of the Wiregrass sports scene over all these years. So rather than me butchering it, Jon, if you would just tell folks what you're doing these days, give us a little bit of an overview, and then let's just jump in.
Sure, and I'm doing what I had dreamed of doing all my life, or at least for as long as I can remember, and that's just being a sports writer. Still sports editor at the Dothan Eagle. Started in 1985, right out of college, a couple of months out of college. But I guess, Bernard, it's when I was maybe in junior high that I decided I wanted to go into sports writing. I love sports, but I knew I was not going to be big enough or strong enough to play college athletics or pro athletics or anything like that. So I really honed in on sports writing, and I love the newspaper. I grew up in Gadsden, Alabama, and in North Alabama. I would read the paper every day. I would go to the library and read other newspapers, the Birmingham News, the Chattanooga Times, anything I could read on sports. I love to read the newspaper. And as I was in high school, I got a typewriter, an electric typewriter for one Christmas. And I would listen to ball games on the radio. And after the game, I would start typing up. It would just be 3 or 4 paragraphs, but
Right.
it was kind of, getting my feet wet, so to speak, on how to do this and how to write. And so in high school, we had a school newspaper, and I was the sports editor of that for a couple of years. And like I said, I went to college to study journalism, but not just journalism, to be a sports writer. I wasn't really interested in politics or being a news writer or any other kind of journalist. I wanted to be a sports writer. So I worked at the school newspaper in college. I worked at a sports information department as a student assistant while I was in college. I started working press boxes while I was in college on Saturdays. You won't remember this, I don't think, but there was this machine called a telecopier. And back then, there wasn't even fax machines. There wasn't computers to send your story through. So writers at that point, we're talking early 1980s, they would carry these big typewriters to the games. They would type their stories, and they would hand the piece of paper to me, the telecopier boy. And I would put it in a machine called a telecopier. It'd take about 5 minutes for one page to go through, but then it would come out on the other end at their newspaper. And then the person at the newspaper would have to type in what they had sent into their system. That's
Wow.
how far we've come.
Yeah.
And I can remember when I first got into this business, my first job at the Eagle, for about a year, maybe 2 years, Bernard, when we would go to college games, we would have to dictate in the game. I would write it out longhand,
Mhm.
and then I would call the office and I would, read it to them, and they would type it into the system.
Wow.
And we finally got these little things called Radio Shacks, which are like a mini computer, sort of. And we
Mhm.
thought that was the greatest invention in the world, because you would type into the Radio Shack, and then you would hook it into a phone, and it would transmit, the words, the story into the newspaper system. And of course, now we do it with these portable laptops whenever we go to games. And now we're even having to do them with high school games, because, our deadlines are much earlier than they used to be. Things have changed so much. Our paper now is printed actually in Opelika, 2 hours away. So on Friday night football, when we always would have an extra deadline, later deadline on Friday nights to get into football games. because you're taking in all kind of calls from games you're not attending. You're editing copy from the writers who are at games. And it's a lot going on in the last couple of hours on Friday night, as you can imagine. Well, we used to have to 12:30 to get everything in the paper, get it out, get it on the press. We now have to basically be done by 11:20. That's everything, because it's going to be printed in Opelika, and you got to give them those 2 hours to get it back to Dothan to get it out on the streets, or to the different houses. So it's, Friday nights are crazy for us. They always have been, but they've gotten even crazier with the earlier deadlines, because we're really pushing it on Friday night. And thank goodness, and this has been the case since I've been part of the Wiregrass. For the most part, coaches are great to work with, and they know there's only a few of us. So if we're not at a game, they're going to call us in the information, or get a stat keeper to call in the information after the game. And it's our duty to get it, typed up quickly, get as many names as we can from players who have done whatever. Because look, moms and dads, they want to see the names in the paper. And, we're putting it together really quick, which
Yeah.
unfortunately that means a lot of times names aren't spelled correctly sometimes, because
Right.
you would be surprised at how many coaches don't even know how to spell the players' names when they call in.
Sure.
So we do the best we can, but it is an adrenaline rush, especially on Friday nights, to get everything done. And
Wow.
despite all the technology, it's still quite a task.
Yeah, the ability to transcribe or to get your material out is probably easier, but it sounds like your margin for error is much smaller, your margin of time. Now, growing up in Gadsden, which high school did you attend?
I went to Gadsden High School,
Okay.
and our big rivals were Emma Sampson, and Litchfield was there as well, and Etowah was a rival.
Sure.
Now, there's just one school now.
Right, right. Well, John, when you were coming up as a teen and before you went off to college, had you found some writers that you really enjoyed their style and kind of guided you? Maybe you hadn't met them, but did they guide you in the style and their reporting that you tried to emulate?
Yeah, and I appreciate you asking me that, because the sports editor at the Gadsden Times was Jimmy Smothers.
Mhm.
And Jimmy, I think he was sports editor there for almost 50 years.
Wow.
And so when I was growing up, he's all I ever knew as a sports editor at the Gadsden Times. And he was a guy who, they used to say if there was a big game, if Jimmy showed up, it was a big game. And Jimmy wrote lots of columns, and he was really the face of the Gadsden Times for throughout my life. And I got to know Jimmy, and he mentored me. I did my internship there from college, but even before that, I was able to meet him, and he showed me the ropes. And as I got into the business, I continued to become better friends with him. And it's a fraternity of sorts, Bernard, throughout the state, because we do see each other at different places. We help each other out. Now it's more so than ever. I mean, if there's something going on in Montgomery, for example, and we can't be there, we call on them to supply the story to us, and they do the same for us. It used to be more competitive because, for example, in Dothan, you would have the Montgomery Advertiser, Birmingham News, different newspapers that were coming into our area. Well, now basically the newspapers really don't come down into Dothan other than the Dothan Eagle. So, and that's kind of the way it is around the state. We help each other out, and it is, you become friends. Some of my best friends are in this business, and Jimmy was one of them.
Well, very good. Well, which college did you end up studying journalism, and why did you end up going there?
Yeah, I went to Auburn, and my dad went there. I grew up pulling for Auburn, but it was also a really strong journalism school at the time. David Housel's a name that a lot of y'all will recall and know. Well, I can remember so well, Bernard, sitting on my bed one night, and I wrote, I bet it was a 10-page letter to David, because at the time he was the journalism professor, and he was in charge of the Plainsman. He oversaw the Plainsman, which was the school newspaper. So I told David what all I wanted to do, all the sports magazines that I was getting at home, stuff he really didn't need to know.
Right.
But I was just trying to find out, what do I need to do when I get to Auburn as far as to get into working for the Plainsman. So he sent me back a nice letter and explained it all to me. And lo and behold, that summer before I went to Auburn, he became the sports information director. And he called me and he said, would you like to work as a student assistant in the sports information department? I didn't get paid a dime, but that was probably the best experience I could ever get. So first day on campus, I went to the Plainsman. It was my first place to go and see how do I sign up. The next place I went was to the Coliseum, which is where the sports information department office was. Talked to David, and I started working. And I worked, throughout my career at both places and made great contacts because I got to see how the writers work. Sports information departments, and I know you're familiar with them because you went to Vanderbilt. They're the bread and butter of how things get done as far as for the athletes. And they supply stuff to the writers. They set up the writers, and I saw how it worked.
And John, was that during the Barfield and Hal Baird eras?
It was the last year of Barfield, 1980. And the first year of Dye was 81, if I've got them right. And so during those years.
And who was the basketball coach at the time? Was it Sonny? Wow. Well, you had 3 or 4 just so well known and so established coaches for those main sports. I know there are plenty of other sports at Auburn at the time, but at least to me, those were the faces of the programs for their respective sports.
Well, and the athletes that were there at that time, I was there from 80 to 85. You had Barkley, you had Bo Jackson, you had Rowdy Gaines, the swimmer. I mean, it was some outstanding sports to watch. And when I did the basketball games for sports information, I would hand out the programs to the writers and everything, but my seat was right under one of the goals. And you talk about, I will never forget, Dominique Wilkins for Georgia going up to do one of his slam dunks, but Barkley met him right in the air and stuffed him and took him down to the floor. And that was right where I was.
Right.
Another really cool thing was when Kentucky was playing Auburn once, and it was a big game. There was this huge monster guy named Charles Hurt for Kentucky. He wasn't a very good basketball player, but he was kind of their instigator.
Right.
So basically, they were trying to get Barkley out of the game. So Barkley's coming down the court, and Hurt gives him basically a block, and he goes right into where I'm sitting, into the table. And Barkley comes back at him. Barkley gets thrown out of the game. Hurt gets thrown out of the game. It doesn't matter that Hurt gets thrown out of the game.
Right.
Barkley went, that hurt Auburn.
Well, I want to see that photo. I don't know if you also took photos or if there was a photographer next to you of Barkley and Dominique meeting in the air. I bet that's spectacular, whoever got the photo. Well, John, you go through your training at Auburn and you make your way down to Dothan. How did you find Dothan? How did they find you? I know at the time we had the Dothan Eagle and the Dothan Progress. I want to know, was there a rivalry there? Was there camaraderie? Tell us about that interaction between the two papers.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how I ended up in Dothan. I had interviewed at several places out of school. And finally, like I said, I'd been out of school about 2 months and I started getting a little worried. So I called my advisor at Auburn. I said, do you know of any openings anywhere? He said, there's one in Tifton, Georgia. Well, I'd already interviewed in Anniston. I'd interviewed in Decatur. I had not interviewed in Dothan. But anyway, I went and interviewed in Tifton. And when I got back to Gadsden, I was offered a job in Tifton, a small newspaper, it's like a 2-person staff. And when I got back to Gadsden, I called the Anniston paper and said, look, I've been offered this job in Tifton. I just want to know where do I stand with y'all? And they said, look, I think we're going to go with a guy that has interviewed from Dothan named Chuck Williams. That's a name you'll probably remember. But Chuck was a sports writer in Dothan at the Eagle. And so they hired Chuck. And so I called the Dothan Eagle.
I was going to say, did a light bulb go off right there?
I called the Dothan Eagle. And I said, and Phil Paramore was the sports editor at that point. And I knew Phil a little bit. I said, understand Chuck is getting the Anniston job. Would you be interested in interviewing me for the Dothan job? And he was. So I came, that was probably on a Saturday. I came down to Dothan on Monday. I was offered the job and I called Tifton and said, thank you, but I'm gonna take the Dothan job. And, that's how I ended up in Dothan. And I was here a year. I went to Montgomery because I thought it was actually the Alabama Journal, the afternoon newspaper. They offered me a job and I thought, okay, I think this is a move up. I probably should take it. And I was at Montgomery not even a year, and I missed Dothan. And I heard about Wiregrass Today starting. It was kind of a knockoff of USA Today, beautiful color, this, that, and the other. And Chuck Williams, the guy who went to Anniston, is the one who told me about Wiregrass Today. He went to Wiregrass Today as they were starting it up, and I interviewed and got a job there as well. So we worked together. And your question as far as the competition at that point, and actually I'll go back a little further. The first day I got to Dothan, Bernard, when I was hired, I called Brian Love, who was at the Dothan Progress, because I knew Brian from Auburn, and asked him where I could find apartments, that kind of thing. So even though we were competitors, the Eagle and the Progress at that time, we were friends. And in fact, Brian kind of showed me the ropes in Dothan. And then when Wiregrass Today came along, we had 3 newspapers, in the city of Dothan.
Yeah.
And you talk about, they really did get competitive then,
Yeah,
because, Wiregrass Today, we're trying to outdo the Progress and the Eagle. And they're trying to do the same. And although we're friends, it was a lot of competition. Unfortunately for Wiregrass Today, it didn't, as far as ad sales and that kind of thing, it didn't pick up. And I actually came into the office one afternoon, and Chuck Williams said, "Man, I heard last night they about shut us down." And ironically, the day before, a guy from the Dothan Eagle had called me and offered me a job back over there. And I'd said, "I appreciate it, but I'm happy with what I'm doing right now, but thank you a lot." Well, after Chuck told me that, I got back on the phone and said, "We need to meet."
Yeah.
And so we did, and I went back over to the Eagle. Unfortunately for Wiregrass Today, it went down less than a year later, but I was back at the Eagle in 1987, I believe, and was fortunate enough to become promoted to sports editor in 1988, and that's where I've been ever since, because Dothan became home. And like I said, when I went to Montgomery, I wanted to come back.
Let me get this straight. You graduate college in 85. You're sports editor of a pretty good sized newspaper by age 25, 26.
Yeah, there's no way in the world I should have been sports editor.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And when I look back at it, I thought I was ready for that. Of course you're going to say yes when someone promotes you, but there's no way I was ready for that. So I've been, it was you learn as you go. And I feel like I'm still learning, and I want to keep growing and get better as the years go on, because you can't get complacent in this or any business.
That's right.
And with technology the way it is and what we've gone through, you've got to stay sharp. And so I've learned over the years. I've learned to adapt, and I've been very fortunate. Like I said, I kind of wanted to be the Jimmy Smothers of Dothan. That was kind of my goal. And I guess maybe I've been able to get that because I guess this is my 35th year.
Well, John, I was just getting ready to say, I don't want to fast forward you too much, but you're in your 30 plus years now doing what you obviously clearly love to do. But I got to pause for a second, John, because we got all kind of love here for you. I got to throw some names that you're going to recognize from years past. Charles Bronson, Jason Mullins, Coach Randy Hicks, Steve Stutz, Twyla Williams, Kevin Jackson, Mike Henry, Eric Easley. KJ says, "What's up, John? The best news guy ever." Twyla says, "We've appreciated John's nice coverage of Northview and now Dothan sports." And Jason wants to know, were you at the he's always stuck on this, and I don't blame him. Were you at the 91 semi-playoff game against Murphy in Mobile? Do you happen to remember that game?
I was not. I have a hard time remembering all the games I were at, but I would remember if I was in Mobile. So I know I wasn't at that. And let me say something about some of those guys. Kevin might be the best athlete that I ever saw at Northview, and there's been some great athletes. I mean, I even think about a guy like Jody White, who was a great athlete, but he never really got that much recognition. Lawrence Dawsey, a great player. But just a Gabe Gross, I mean, what an athlete there. But Kevin, as far as an all-around athlete, great football player. He was a great basketball player, and goes on to be a great college football player at Alabama. And that's one of the things that makes my job so satisfying, is to get to know these people as they're growing up, and then watching them have success on the different levels. It was a thrill for me to watch Kevin coach at Dothan High the night he beat Northview, because I know how emotional that must have been for him. You know, playing his old school, he's the coach at Dothan High. And, you know, I've become, you know, very good friends with Kevin over the year and a lot of these people. And I think that's what makes my job so fulfilling, is that I get to watch these people as they progress. Gabe Gross, I shot basketball with him. First time I saw him was at Westgate Gym when he was probably 12 or 13 years old playing basketball. And then I coached against him when I was coaching in the junior league basketball. And then I was telling you before we went on the air, I coached David, your brother, in junior. I coached junior league basketball for 15 years in the city. And
that a lot of athletes.
I love that because I got to see some athletes early on. And then as they went on to high school, got to cover them. You know, I got to see Gabe play junior league basketball, you know, high school sports, and he was a great baseball player, great football player. Then at Auburn, got to cover his career. I remember the first game he got in as a quarterback, he replaced Ben Leard against Tennessee. And after the game, you do all the press conference stuff and all that kind of good stuff. But then after the press conference, when he stepped outside, I was able to step outside with him and his parents and just, you know, visit with him, talk to him, and get to know him. And then when he got in the major leagues, we found out he was going to be making his first start to begin the opening season for the Blue Jays. They were going to be at Tampa. And back when we could do a lot more as far as with our money, they said, go down there and watch him for his first game and write about it. So I got to see Gabe make his first, you know, start of the season, you know, when he was with Toronto.
How cool.
And all of that is what makes it all worthwhile. It's the relationships and, you know, those names you just went through, the coaches you get to know. Mike Henry's one of the great guys. And people like, you know, all the Randy Hicks, you get to know them more than just the coach and writer or player and writer. You get to know them as people, and that's what makes this fun.
Yeah, that's one of the great things I think about. Dothan's not a small town compared to other towns, but it's not so big that you don't know people socially. But high school sports just has, for the most part, a purity about it that college and pros, certainly in my opinion, do not have. And that's what's so fun, because it's so emotionally driven. It's so important. It's so important not only to the players on the field, but the families in the stands. And, you know, the last one to the stadium, turn off the lights to the city because everybody's going to be there, kind of a thing. But John, let's take it now to your first football season in Dothan, which happens to be my senior year of high school, which happens to be a pretty special year for the Northview Cougars. And I'm not going to pin you down to what happened in the third game and the fourth period, you know, those kind of things. But what were some of your impressions about new city, new town, new responsibilities, but obviously a job that not a job, a profession, because if you've been doing it this long and still enjoying it, it's not a job. To me, a job is a chore I have to do, like rake the yard. A profession is something that I enjoy doing every day, something that I do professionally. So take us to that 1985 first season for you in Dothan.
Well, it's funny how some things just kind of still stick out in your mind. And I can remember one of the first Northview games, just looking down on the sidelines. Not that this is anything at all, but I just remember how many players were on the sidelines for Northview, and was thinking, I was sitting in the Rip Hughes press box. And later on, I started where I would get on the sidelines to follow high school football. As far as during the game, you like to walk the sidelines and keep the stats. But for the first season, I remember sitting in the press box, and I can just remember looking down, and the Northview sidelines was on our sidelines, and just looking at all the players. And then the one game that stands out to me is that Dothan game. Dothan won 13-10, and tell me if I get the score wrong, but I think that was it in overtime.
You're right. Scotty Denny's with field goal.
It was a great game, but I can't tell you one thing about the game. What I remember, though, and again, it's funny how just visions stick out in your mind. I remember looking down after the game and noticing Lawrence Dawsey and I think Alex Thomas, but the handshaking and thinking, God, that's some talent down there. I mean, look at those guys. I mean, yourself, Alex Thomas, you know, you played at Vanderbilt. Alex played at Auburn. Lawrence played at Florida State. Dennis Tillman, I don't know where he played, but he was a great athlete. But there were so many great athletes on both sides. And that's what I took away from that first year in Dothan is, man, this is pretty special. And then just the crowds at the Dothan Northview games. And it was like that every year. I mean, that was something special. It didn't matter what the records are. It's kind of like the Alabama Auburn thing. It just didn't matter. There was going to be a big crowd and it was going to mean something. And that's when I say, you know, I knew how much that meant to Kevin when he beat his alma mater, because that had to be very emotional. Being a coach of going against the school that you played on. And that's been the same with, you know, Janaski Fleming coaching basketball at Northview and now Dothan Wolves, to where he was a great athlete at Dothan High, you know. So, I mean, there's so many storylines there, and I really do feel privileged to be able to be a part of that and to watch, you know, girl athletics develop. I mean, we're talking softball wasn't around when I started, and soccer. You look at the soccer programs. I remember the very first soccer program at Northview, the boys program. Then the girls came along, and you know, Twala is on here tonight. Her daughter was a great player at Northview, and is now the coach of the Dothan High School. And you know, I've seen a lot develop that wasn't even here when I first got here.
You're so right. There were just the major sports, the traditional major sports at Northview at the time. But I've been so pleased to see that volleyball and, as you mentioned, soccer and softball. Is there a swim program that's current at Dothan High? You know, all of those programs, at least in the 80s, were just not part of the Dothan city school systems, high school programs. But I'm so glad that they're there. But going back to the mid 80s when you were first starting with Dothan, but you're right about any games involving Northview and Dothan, because as many who've been on this show before you, they all talk about the neighborhoods where everybody grows up, and I'm just overwhelmed at the caliber and volume of such talented kids from one neighborhood. And some go to Northview, some go to Dothan High, and they're all rivals and they want to beat each other on the field, off the field. I haven't heard of any real rivalries where it's been nasty or anything like that. But I always knew with those football games, several of those guys at Dothan High, I was going to see again in the spring on the baseball field. And I know Lawrence knew he'd see those guys in the winter on the basketball court. So it was just, you know, for 4 straight years, you're competing against some of the very best athletes in our community. And I think that's what drove everybody to excellence at different times. Just knowing how great the athletic competition was across the field from you.
And I think, and you can speak to this as an athlete, I think there was a mutual respect there. It was a rivalry, but I don't think it was a nasty rivalry. Never has been. I think there was a lot of respect because y'all grew up together. Heck, y'all played ball together at the different youth fields growing up. You would play basketball over at Westgate or whatever. It wasn't like Dothan's over here and Northview's over here. They would play together in different things growing up. And then when you went to high school, of course, it was a rivalry, but I think there was a lot of respect. Am I right there?
I absolutely believe in that and agree with you. All right, I'm going to put you on the hot seat for just a minute or two, and I want to talk about how did Coach Parrish deal with the press? Coach Harry Wayne Parrish, not Josh, but Coach Harry Wayne Parrish. What was your take? What was your impression on how he dealt with the press?
My take would be he was very protective of his players. Harry Wayne's a great guy, but he was a team. This is a team sport. He wasn't real big on individual interviews, and he was, I won't say to the extent of a Nick Saban type coach, as far as Nick Saban to me is very paranoid about how he handles things within his team. But Harry Wayne Parrish was a little bit of that. He did not want anyone to interfere with anything that might disrupt his team.
That was certainly, John, my experience, that frankly, until you were a senior in his football program, and even then it was still very limited on access. You might be able to talk for a minute or two after a game, but Coach Parrish really just wanted the players focused on playing and not so much what he would call getting the big head. Oh, I'm getting interviewed by John tonight and Brian tomorrow. You know, those kind of things were just really not part of his system. just like a lot of times, right or wrong, good or bad, when the recruiting process started up, he would, I think, try to shield most of the players from the coaches and the letters and all of that until they really wanted you to focus on the immediate, the team needs and the team stuff, which today, the current athlete, I don't know how that flies, those types of coaching styles, but at least back then, that's what worked for Coach Parrish.
Sure, sure. And he was very good at that. It is different now. I mean, these kids want their name out there. They're doing all the Twitter stuff. And I don't think the coaches can be as involved as they used to be, unfortunately.
Well, the kids want to brand themselves. When you've got, now this is an extreme example, but you've got Zion Williamson coming out of high school and he already has 2 million followers on Instagram. He's a brand. We all knew he was only going to college because that was what was required by the NBA and at that time, but that's what kids do now. They want to start branding themselves. But back then, I hate to say this because it makes me sound like an old dude, is times were simpler. No cell phones, no internet, none of those things. It was just, you just played ball.
Yeah, I kind of wish for those days.
Yeah. Well, talk about a typical Friday night in the press box at Rip Hughes. Set the scene for us. Let's say that we're playing Carroll or Enterprise, one of the region games back then. Who's in the press box? What's it like in there?
Okay. Well, like I said, as I got on a couple of years into it, I would go to the sidelines, but the press box had got so cramped. It's the problem. You have your PA announcer, you have officials that are keeping the clocks. And, it's easier to watch the game from the press box because you got a better view. But what we started doing, Bernard, is going down and actually covering the game from the sidelines as far as keeping the stats. Mm-hmm. And I would tell any sports writer will tell you this: if you can cover high school football, you can cover anything because it's much tougher than covering college football. Mm-hmm. If you're in a college press box, they hand you the play-by-play. They hand you the stats. You're sitting there with all that stuff, and basically you're watching the game and you got to pull it together, but they hand it to you. In high school, you're keeping your own stats. I'm keeping every play. In fact, Brian Love taught me how to do it the way he did it. And everyone does it a little different, but there's not a scorebook like you have for baseball. In college football, I put down every play. And then when I go back and write it, or whether I'm in the office or in the press box, at least I've got a recording of every play that's happened in the game. And then you keep the stats kind of as you're going along. I've got a little system that I can do it. It's not going to be perfect, but that's what we do. And a lot of it is from the sidelines because that way we can kind of get a better view of where the ball is as far as the yard marker and that kind of thing. And thankfully, in 35 years, I've never been run over, but I've come close.
That was going to be my next question. Were you so involved in what you're doing, your job, that maybe you didn't appreciate what was right in front of you because it happened so quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another reason of sometimes being on the sidelines, you can go and say, hey, who made that? Who got the fumble? I missed it. Or, because you miss stuff. And I'll tell you, at college games, on night games, which our deadlines are so tight at times, there's a lot of the game I don't see because even though it's right in front of me, I'm starting to write in the second half. And, a lot of times you're just kind of looking up and down because a lot of times we have to have our stories done basically right when the game ends. And so the fun part of going to college games, I'll tell you this, is before the game starts, you get to eat the free food, you get to socialize with the people. You can watch the first half and enjoy it, but by the second half you're working. And in high school football, there's no playtime. I mean, once that whistle starts, you're keeping every stat, like I said, and then you're hustling back to the office or either you're writing it from the stadium. And now because of our deadlines, all of our writers are writing from the stadiums. Bernard, they may be sitting in the bleachers. And when that game ends, I need that story about 5 to 10 minutes after it's over to meet our deadlines. And I have written, Twyla will appreciate this, I've covered soccer because our regular night deadlines are 9:30. I've covered a soccer game from Westgate and written the end of the story in my car. I had a parking spot where I could still see the field, but write the story and then right when it ends would have to send it to make the paper. So sports writers will send wherever we have to.
Yeah.
whether it's down in the grass or, and we've been locked, there's plenty of riders who've been locked in stadiums because.
I was just getting ready to say, and John, you're probably trying to beat them turning the lights out, and you're sitting there doing your typing.
Some of them are real nice about that. Take your time. A lot of them aren't. And I know riders who have had to climb fences to get out of stadiums locked in. I haven't had to do that, but I do know those that have. And I've been in a lot of McDonald's sending stories from out of town games.
I bet. Well, as you said, in the 80s, you had till 12:30 at night to get your stuff in, to get it to get it to Opelika, or was it Opelika?
No, we had it our own press at the Eagle until about 4 years ago.
Oh,
and so
okay.
We had longer. We had to 12:30 to get it done, and then at 1 the press started. Well, now the press is 2 hours away, so we have to have the stuff done. It's transmitted to Opelika.
Right.
But
Well, what I was going to say is you had till 12:30 back in the 80s. So overtime games, of which we had 5 of them in 1985, you're not as pressed. What if you're having multiple overtime game now on a Friday night and you have a shorter deadline, but it's a great game? You can't even enjoy the game, I bet, because you're doing your job.
Yeah, and one of the things that readers, I'm sure, will notice is used to on Friday nights, we would interview the coach, players, whatever after the game, and then go back to the office, and then you'd have you really got to have the story written within an hour, but 45 minutes or so, let's say. And now, I mean, we're really, honest to goodness, when that game ends at 10 o'clock or whenever, we need that story in the system by about 10:15 at the latest, because we got 2 or 3 stories coming in. Yeah. And I'm usually one back at the office taking in the call-ins and composing those, and then getting it on the page, and then proofing the page, and then sending it out. And so, unfortunately, we don't have time to get quotes from high school games on Friday night. We're just glad we're able to get in what we do. And thankfully, we do still have, they give us till 11:20 to get it done. And like I said, as the coaches are so good to help us, we're able to get most every game in there. Now, early in the years when all the heat timeouts are going on, and with COVID and all that kind of stuff, games were running a little later, it made it tougher. But it is a race to the finish. But we get in mostly what we were normally getting in. We're just doing it an hour earlier.
Wow. Oh, got some more folks who've rolled in. Jonelle Walsingham Kirkland says to tell you hello. And the Eufaula principal, Revis Gertman.
Yeah.
Says to tell you hello.
Hello to Jonelle, and Revis was a fine player at Northview, that's for sure.
Yeah, hope you guys are doing well. So thank you for stopping by. Obviously, we're talking with Jon Johnson. John, let's kind of take it through the years. You've seen Northview football for 30 plus years up until 2018, and now it's the Dothan High Wolves. Any particular coaches, players, games, plays, moments that stick out? I know you've mentioned several of the players you've had the privilege to either coach against or get to know pretty well. But there's, and Coach Josh Parrish, our last coach at Northview's just signed on. Hey, Josh. I know there's probably a flood of memories there. Anything that really sticks out in your mind? Anything particular?
There's been so many different coaches in football over the years. And I know there was that long streak of losing, that just things weren't going so well. But there was never any quit in Northview, as far as they still went out there and gave it all they had. I mean, you look back, even you think of some of the coaches. Mike DuBose, I mean, he was coach at Northview and they didn't win a game. That was a strange year. Levy Boutwell was an interesting character. Willard Whitcomb, who took over, I think, from when Harry Wayne retired, if I'm not mistaken.
He did.
What a nice guy he was. I mean, and a good coach. He was a very good coach.
Coach Billy Kennard was right in there.
Was something else, and I'm going to tell you, I got to know him very well, but Billy kind of picked who he liked. And Billy was a different individual, but a very good coach. And I think maybe he liked me because I was one of the older guys at that time, and I think he could maybe identify with me a little better. But I got to know him really well. And one of the things that with all these coaches is that, if you do get to know them, well, then they know you're not out to get them, I guess. When even when Billy resigned, when you find out things like that and they don't want to talk about it, It's a tough situation for us because we know something has happened. We know as a reporter, you're supposed to get the news out. And sometimes they don't want you to get the news out or they don't want to talk about it. But that's where you build those relationships and hopefully, they will trust you to do it the right way. There's no easy right or wrong way to do it. I can remember Willard Whitcomb was going to go back to Chipley. We found out about it, felt like we had to write about it. We did write about it. And one of his players, I think two or three of his players, came up to the office. They were mad. They were mad because we wrote about it. And I said, look, guys, you got to understand this is news that, as reporters, we have to get out there. And I know he didn't want it out yet, but you got to realize, he's also leaving y'all to go to a different school,
Yeah.
So I know this hurts y'all, but we're just doing our job. And did we do anything wrong? Was anything wrong about that story is what I asked them. And they said, no, sir. And I said, well, look, we're just trying to do our job. That's what we have to do. And they were very polite and understanding. And they said, I understand now. And so sometimes you just got to explain it because a lot of people look at press as the bad guys, that we love to write negative articles. We like to write about when things are bad. And there's nothing further for the truth, especially in sports. I mean, look, 99.9% of the people who get into sports writing get into it because they love writing about sports and the games. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing more, I don't enjoy calling a coach and say, hey, I understood, you were fired, right. But I need to ask you about it. And some are good about it, some aren't, and I understand it. But our job is to at least give them that opportunity to say something. And if, some of them are going to like it and some of them obviously won't even answer the phone. But that's not the fun part of the job, but it's part of it.
I'm sure that as you grew in your profession, you developed a little thicker skin as anybody would in their respective professions, and you just figured out how to deal with it. But I will tell you, Jon, in this Northview football Facebook group that we're growing, I'm slowly accumulating all the articles that I can ever find on the program going back to '78. And I don't know, there's probably 200 articles that so far we've cataloged and put in there. I cannot tell you how many. There are so many of your work, your fine work that's in there, and the comments. I hope you'll join the group so you can just go back and see the comments that are in there. But reliving these memories have just been so great for so many people. So thank you for all the work that you've done over the years. It really has brought a lot of joy to people.
And that's why we do it. I mean, to me, it's recording history, and for people to cut out and keep and, for their families to see. That's what makes it fun for me, to be honest with you, is when I write something that someone I think likes about themselves or their family members, whether it's a game or a feature story or whatever. Our job is we try to be fair and straight down the middle and do it the right way. But if I know someone, the fun part for me is feeling like I've done a solid job and that they like it, because it's not about me. It's about giving some attention to someone who deserves it.
Yeah, and not everybody's gonna like everything that you write. In fact, a lot of people.
And if you write about little Johnny,
they'll get bruised a little bit here or there.
Right, and if you write about, once they get to high school, we feel like, okay, if they make an error, we can say Johnny Smith made an error. He's old enough, he should be able to handle it. But a lot of times we write around that. We'll put the shortstop made an error. But I've had people call me and say, I've ruined the kid's day because, and it does hurt you. It still hurts you. It hurts you as a writer when you feel like, oh, okay, I see, because I'm a parent. And, but, so it is a fine line. You try to treat these kids once they get to high school level, at least like, okay, if they make a mistake as part of the game, they fumble, you can say who fumbles or who threw the interception. They should be able to handle it.
Oh, I can assure you, Jon, all of my interceptions were made the paper, and all of my errors at shortstop, they made the paper. But it's what it is. It's being reported upon, and it's good, bad, or indifferent. But I do have a great comment from Josh Parrish, who probably, I think, arguably witnessed more Northview football games than anybody in the program's history, because he was around the program as a small child, all of those years when his dad, Harry Wayne, was the coach, then comes back to be the coach. So I don't know what the percentage of games are, but I'm sure you're not going to find too many people who've seen more games or participated in more games than Josh. But he said it was just kind of weird for you to be covering the games when he was a small child and then still be covering the games when he came back as the head coach.
Yeah, because I remember when Josh was on the sideline as a small child. He did a heck of a job as a coach too. And I know how much he loved that school and that program. And I'm glad he got that opportunity. I really am.
Yeah, me too. We all wished he was still coaching there, but it is what it is, and he's moved on to something better going on. Well, John, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me tonight. This has been a fun trip for me, down some great memories, and I really appreciate you sharing your journey with us.
Well, it's been a ball for me. Thank you for asking me. And I appreciate, the Northview community and what they've meant to me over the years as well.
Well, it's been a mutual admiration, I'm sure, for most of the time. I'm sure there's been some tense times in there, but those tend to fade away. But thank you again, John. We hope that you continue doing what you're doing, and we look forward to continue reading and interacting with you from your work going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, everyone who listened.
Absolutely, guys. And again, another awesome conversation with Cougars, Jon Johnson with the Dothan Eagle, and just been so part of the Northview program for so many years. Guys, we're going to keep moving forward with these. We'll see you again next Wednesday. Have a safe week, and y'all have a good night. Take care.